Hi everyone and welcome to October's Research Rules. My name is Koval Ambalia and I'm happy to be hosting today's session. Today, our race is covering literature, statistical and writing tips. Donaldo will cover some tips and tools that you can pick up. The nice thing about today's session is it can fit anyone beginning in the field or advanced because we can always improve in conducting literature review, statistical analysis and writing. Donaldo Canales serves as a lead methodology reviewer of all protocols submitted to Horizon's Human Research Protection Program (HRPP). In this role, he ensured that submitted research protocols are methodologically sound, scientifically valid, and feasible. In addition to HRPP reviews, Donaldo provides methodological statistical consultation to Horizon clinicians and researchers engaged in health research. Donaldo has a background in applied social psychology, particularly within forensic psychology, and has conducted research related to recidivism prediction, mental health, personality, and offending, and policy psychology. We will begin now.
Good morning from me, and probably good evening to you. My name is Donaldo Canales, and I am a methodologist here at Research Services at Horizon. And Dana has kindly invited me to speak to you about writing tips and literature stuff. And so I decided to focus in on developing a research protocol. Um, a lot of what I will say during this presentation is not just textbook information. A lot of it I'm drawing from my own experiences. So this presentation will have that unique angle. But I love talking about this topic because I think that research protocols are a very, very important topic. Doing them right is crucially important to the success of any project. And I'm happy to share everything that I've learned along my career. First of all, we should talk about what is a research protocol. In general, a research protocol is an overall description of a study. It's a document that is a record of all the details of a research study. It describes the rationale for a study, it describes its objectives and its methodology. So, the methodology being how to perform the actual study itself. The other interesting thing about protocols I find in my experience is that it allows investigators to really clarify and crystallize their thoughts. And it allows them to think clearly about how all aspects of the study interconnect. Because sometimes when you're thinking about things, it's not quite clear how the pieces fit. You know a little bit about the background, you know a little bit about the methods, but you don't really know how well they mesh together. And a protocol helps you really streamline all that and figure out all those nuances and details. Protocols also provide a detailed description of all the steps that are involved on carrying out a study. So much so that a well-written protocol by me, for example, could be given to any one of you, and you could carry out the study yourselves. So if you wrote a protocol and included all the details and it was well thought out and well written, I could take that information and carry out the study myself. So it's a really important piece of it's a really important document that all researchers should strive um, to make sure it's well written and highly detailed. Protocols don't just magically appear from thin air. You need to start with a study idea. Now, you may be asking yourself, how do you even come up with a study idea? Well, there's so many different ways that you can do this. One thing that I do is when I'm I work with a lot of different researchers in different fields, and I don't really have much knowledge in any of these fields. So what I do is when I connect with the researcher and they tell me about the research idea, I try and familiarize myself with the research literature on that specific topic. Sometimes I'm literally starting from scratch. I don't know anything about, I don't know a thing about the topic. So what I will do is I will go to the research literature, start reading papers, and I will tend to emphasize papers that have been published in the past 5 years. So that gives you a good overview of the current state of the literature on a given topic. So when I'm reading some of these studies, I try to focus in on what's known about the topic, what's not known about it. I look for I look to see what the authors are saying about limitations in current research, directions for future research, and based on all that information, after reading perhaps a handful of studies, I tend to have a good idea of what are the shortcomings of the current research state, the state of research on a given topic, and then from there I can try and think of ideas as to what direction we can go. Another option is to simply just brainstorm ideas. Surround yourself with people who know about a topic or other like-minded researchers and start brainstorming. I remember when I was doing my master's, um, during my master's thesis, prior to prior to having my idea, I we really didn't know anything about what I was going to study for my master's, and we were shooting ideas back and forth, and nothing was really sticking. And my supervisor and I went to a meeting off campus, and during the 10-minute ride back to the university, I just made some statement, and she kind of fed off that, and then we bounced ideas back and forth, and my master's thesis was born. So it can happen very, very quickly. Another thing that you can do is you can just observe the world around you. There's a lot of problems in the world, and problems give way to solutions. There's always new ways of doing things, things that you notice are not really working all that well. How could you improve upon certain things? Programs, interventions, treatments, how certain populations are affected by certain conditions, and so on and so forth. So sometimes it's just observing what's going on around you and keeping an eye out for current trends, and what people are talking about can sometimes give you ideas for research. One important consideration when you're coming up with an idea is to try and make sure that the idea makes an original contribution to knowledge. There is a time and place for replication research. That would be research that takes what somebody else has done and basically replicates it in a new population or a new site. Those studies are important, and we need to do those types of studies. But I think the biggest bang for your buck is trying to make an original contribution to knowledge, and those are the studies that tend to be the most novel. They tend to be highly publishable, and if you're applying for grants, they're more likely to be funded. So what are the main sections of a protocol? Well, there's several main sections that you can see here on the screen. To my left, probably right in front of you, but it's to my left. You have the title page, the project summary, the background, which an important subsection of that is the research question, or questions if you have more than one. The methods, and under that would be four main subsections: conclusion and the reference section. So those are the main sections of a research protocol. For this presentation, though, I will focus on the background and the methods. The background being why the study should be performed, and the methods being how it should be performed. So these two sections together cover the why and the how. And since all my background is in quantitative methods, I'll just focus all my examples and a lot of my comments on from a more quantitative perspective, since that is my expertise. Once you have an idea kind of figured out more or less, and you have read some of the literature, it's time to write the background. So what is the purpose of the background? Fundamentally, the background of a protocol is what you write to fully justify the need for your study. It is what becomes the rationale for your study. Why are you doing this? Why is this topic important? Are there issues in the research, in past research, that need to be resolved? Are you planning on extending this research to new areas or new populations? Is it a neglected issue? Is it something that you notice that nobody has studied before? Therefore, the reason for your study. So you need to think about why your topic is important. Um, what research has also been done on the topic already? So in the background section, you need to give a overview of all the research that's been done on this topic. Now, when I say all the research, I don't mean that you need to describe every study that's ever been done on the topic. This isn't a meta-analysis. This is not a systematic review. What you need to do is you need to familiarize yourself enough with the literature to be able to summarize or critically evaluate major arguments and conclusions. What a lot of people do, and I find and I used to do this as well, is you take a topic and then you start describing all the research that's ever been done on it chronologically from the start. And that can be problematic if that could be okay if it's a relatively new area, but if it's a topic that's been around for 50 years, like you can't possibly do that. So try and find the big studies, the main studies, more recent studies, meta-analyses, and systematic reviews if there are any, and that will help you write your background section and review all the existing research in a more concise manner. You also want to talk about how your study is different. So we know all this information about this topic, but what are you doing? What's so important and special about you and your study? You need to set yourself apart. You need to talk about how your study is different and how it adds to the body of knowledge on this particular topic. When people come to me for assistance with the background, I usually have them think about it like a funnel, as you can see here on the screen. So you have all the information, you have the literature, now you have to organize it into some logical format. And what I tell people is to think of a background section like a funnel. So you start off, hope you can see my hands, you start off very broad at the top, and then you get more and more narrow with all your information. And at the very, very bottom is your research question. So and we'll get to that in 1 second. So you start off very broad and get more specific and more specific and more specific. So think about it like a funnel, general to specific. The background section typically leads into a statement of your research question. Now, the research question is probably one of the most important parts of a protocol. It is the question around which you center your research. It is clear, it is focused, it is concise. For example, the purpose of the current research is to examine the side effects associated with this drug. Another example would be the purpose of this research is to evaluate the impact of this new psychoeducational program on health literacy in patients over 65. You can see it's a very clear and focused and concise statement. And your entire background section should be leading you towards this research question. So for the psychoeducational program on health literacy in patients over 65, you may start very broadly talking about health literacy just in general. What are the ins and outs of it? What are the levels of health literacy? How how researchers in the past have tried to address it, what types of programs, and then you can review several main types of programs and then focus in on psychoeducational programs, and then talk about maybe differences in populations. Maybe younger folks are a little bit more have a little bit more health literacy versus older people. So there's a need to evaluate this new psychoeducational program in health literacy in patients. So you can see you can start very, very broad and get more focus as you work through the background section, all the way down to the research question. And we will come back to the research question several times in the forthcoming slides because it's that important. The next major section is the methods, and the methods section describes how the study will be performed, how it will be conducted. And it consists of 4 major subheadings. That would be the participants section, followed by measures and materials, the procedure, and the proposed analyses. The methods section should be rich in detail. It should be sufficiently detailed that it would allow a reader to evaluate the appropriateness of your methods. It should be detailed enough that other people can assess the reliability and the validity of your results. And importantly, it should be detailed enough that other researchers can replicate your study. So you need to find a balance, right? You want to provide enough information so that other people can critically evaluate your research and replicate it if needed, but not so much that you're drowning the reader in non-essential details. So it's kind of finding that middle ground in between those two extremes. Now, this last point about allowing people to replicate your study, this last point is a fundamental piece of good science. We, as researchers, as uncomfortable as it may seem, we want other people to be able to review and evaluate our own research. That's what makes the work stronger. That's a fundamental part of science. It provides an opportunity for flawed ideas and assumptions to be discarded or revised, and allows good ideas to be expanded and built upon. So it's not always the most comfortable thing, but it's important for good science and the advancement of knowledge. So the first major subsection is the participants. This section answers the question, is your sample the right group of people to provide you with the data that you need to answer the question? So it's all about the people. Who is involved in your study? Who are you recruiting? And are they appropriate to address your research questions? So you'll want to answer a few questions within this subsection. Who are these people? Who are they? Who are the people who are involved? What are any key features or characteristics about these people that the readers need to know? Who is included? Who is excluded? What are the criteria for inclusion and exclusion? All that is a very important detail. You also want to describe how you are obtaining your sample. This allows other people, it allows them the opportunity to examine the appropriateness of your sample, particularly when people want to generalize your results. So I'll give you one example. As part of my doctoral program, I did a comprehensive project and I examined psychosocial outcomes of people who play video games. So people who are hardcore gamers, what are their relationships like, their mental health, their work life, family life, all sorts of things. So I would get very different results if I sampled from a hardcore video gaming group versus the general population. 2 very different types of people, and both of them would lead me to very different conclusions. So one would be appropriate for my research question and the other one would not be. So those are the things that you need to talk about and describe in this participants section. The next major section is the measures and materials. So this section provides you with the details of all the measures, all the surveys, all the devices that you need to perform your study. So in here, you would provide background information. You would provide where you would get background information on your participants. Sometimes that can be in the form of a survey. Sometimes you're going into patient charts and extracting that information. If you are administering questionnaires, you need to describe your questionnaires. You need to probably include copies of them so other people can review the questionnaires as well. And if you have any clinical or mechanical devices, you need to talk about them and you need to talk about what are their strengths and weaknesses and why they are appropriate for your study. For each measure, you need to include information about its reliability and its validity. Particularly when you're dealing with devices and surveys, you need to convince your readers that that what you are using is reliable and valid. Think of reliability like accuracy. Is the measure accurate? Can it give you accurate and consistent results time after time? And is it valid? Think of valid as kind of like truth. Is the measure is, for example, if you have a measure of depression, is this measure of depression actually truly measuring depression? That would be an indication of validity. It's the truthfulness. Does this measure actually represent this construct of depression or anxiety, whatever the the construct it is that you are measuring? Another important thing to keep in mind is that I find that sometimes a lot of people, for the measures and the materials, they start including variables and measures that I feel are interesting, but not relevant to the research question. And this is why it's important to have a well thought out research question and a well written background. I find that sometimes I'm reading, I'm reviewing an article, I'm reviewing a paper, a protocol, and it seems to make sense. And then I get to the measure section, and then they talk about this collecting information on this one particular variable that has nothing to do with the research question. So I start flagging that, like bells started going off in my head. Why are you collecting this information? How is it relevant? Let's say that you were doing a study on quality of life in people, but then one of the measures is blood pressure. You're like, okay, so you're interested in quality of life. So that would be like family, relationships, mental health, all that sort of stuff. And then you have a measure of blood pressure. What does that have to do with this? I mean, it could have some relationship with it. Maybe blood pressure is an indication of stress and that's relevant to quality of life. But if there's no information in the background section, it just seems very out of place. And I find that a lot of researchers will collect all sorts of variables just for the hell of it, just because they sound interesting or could possibly be analyzed in some way, shape, or form. My advice to you would be to only include those measures that are relevant and appropriate and will most directly address your research question. The next major subsection is the procedure. So this section provides the details of how the study will proceed step by step from the beginning to the end in chronological order. So think of this like the recipe of your study. Like, what are you going to do first? What comes next? What comes after that? And so on and so forth. Write this section like you're holding the hand of the reader. And like just pretend you're holding my hand and just walking me through your study and explain everything to me in this section. How did you recruit people into your study? How did you obtain informed consent? Who obtained informed consent? Did you send out a survey? Was the survey online? Was it in person? If it was in person, where did you do this? Like, it must have happened in a room somewhere. If it was online, what online program did you use? Did you conduct surveys? Did you conduct in-person interviews? Did you access medical charts? If you did access medical charts, how did you extract that information? Was the data file just given to you on a USB stick? Did you have to go in the files and extract that information onto paper sheets? Who did that? Where are you storing these paper sheets? Where are you storing your data, if whether it be digital or paper? So you see what I mean? You need to provide all that information so somebody could read that and follow through all the steps and be able to replicate your study. So in this, some of the major things that you want to hit on is your strategies and your procedure for recruitment, for consent, for data collection, and data storage and access. And I think I covered that as I was just rambling on there. But very important points, all the way from getting all that information from your participants and storing it in some secure location ready to be analyzed. And the last major subsection of the methods is the data analysis plan. This section is one of my favorite sections and one that I pay a lot of attention to. And it describes the proposed data analyses. I want to stress that analyses are not an afterthought. Analyses are one of the most important aspects of your research protocol. I find that sometimes when I'm reading protocols, the background section is well written, the methods are detailed, the participants, the materials, the procedure. Then it gets to the data analysis plan and people just say, oh, we'll just analyze the data. Well, that's not really sufficient. It's not really good enough. You need to specify exactly what analyses you will do and what are their specifications. And importantly, there should be a clear link between every analysis that you plan to do and your research question. So the selection of the analyses is directly linked to addressing your research question. Sometimes you may have to do supplemental analysis to describe your sample, maybe a couple other side analyses to support the main analysis. But in general, one should be able to read your analysis plan and make a direct link back to the research question. Often the most appropriate analysis is the most simple analysis that will most effectively answer your research question. I find that a lot of people will get hung up on fancy and overcomplicated stats, and sometimes they get really excited about a particular analysis and they'll allow the analysis to drive the research question. So they learn a new technique and they're like, wow, if only I had this type of data, I could analyze, I could use this technique. So in order to have this type of data, I need to ask this type of research question. And if I have this type of research question, I need to write a background section that supports that research question. So it's they start from the analyses and work backwards. It's not a good approach. I don't advise that. Don't get hung up on all these crazy stats. Just do the most simple one that will most effectively answer your research question. Also, analyses and the analysis plan should always be focused on the variables that you plan to analyze and the tests that which you plan to use. So always make sure that researchers always assume that the readers have knowledge of common statistical tests. Always describe your analyses in detail, but you don't have to go overboard explaining every nuance with the analysis. Just focus in on the most central analyses to address your research question. Assume that the researcher has some knowledge of common statistical tests, and if there are any uncommon stats that are not frequently used, you may need to explain those in a little bit more detail. Lastly, you need a rationale for your sample size. Analyses are very sensitive. A lot of them require specific types of variables. All of them have sample size requirements in order for them to be valid and reliable. You can estimate a sample size by a procedure called a power analysis. So power analyses are a technique that you can use to arrive at a sample size estimate. They can be a little complex. Even I get hung up on them every now and then, but know that if you're doing any sort of formal analyses, you need to really think about what type of sample size or how big of a sample size you need. Even if you're not doing complex analyses, even if you're just doing something descriptive or qualitative in nature, there should be some indication, some rationale for the number of participants that should be included. I have here on the next slide an example of a couple analyses plans. The first one at the top, data will be analyzed using t-tests. That to me is wholly inefficient, wholly just devoid of information that tells me nothing about what you're doing. What data will be analyzed, how will it be analyzed, what are the grouping variables, the outcome variables, t-tests. There's at least 3 different types of t-tests. So that type of statement is not sufficient for an analysis plan. The second one, which I wrote, is more appropriate. Paired sample t-tests will be used to assess differences in quality of life pre-post program X. The power analysis estimated that 67 participants or patients are needed to power this analysis. The program, on average, admits 20 patients per month. Recruitment will occur over 4 months. So to get an expected sample of 80 patients, and that should be sufficient to power the analysis and allow some room for dropouts, because not everybody who participates in a program will complete it. So if enrollment rates are lower than expected, or if there's a higher rate of dropouts, the study can be extended for an additional few months. So that would be an example of a more detailed analysis. It indicates which specific t-test will be used. It indicates the variable of interest, which is quality of life. You know that it's being performed pre and post the program. So it's probably an intervention of some kind. The power analysis tells you how many patients you need. There's a couple statistical parameters there, which are a little beyond this presentation, but you include the inputs that allow you to arrive at your final estimated sample size. And then you talk about recruitment. So 4 months is enough to get 80 people and allow some room for dropouts. But if you don't get the 67, you can extend the program for a bit of time. So there's a backup contingency plan built into the study. So good analysis plan versus not so good analysis plan. And lastly, the last 2 sections of a protocol are the conclusion and the references. So the conclusion sentence, the conclusion section, people will just usually include a paragraph at the end. Sometimes they won't include a conclusion. They will have a potential implications section. And that's it just kind of wraps everything up. It's not a crucial integral part of a protocol. It's just to kind of summarize everything and just wrap everything up in a nice little package. And there is the reference section. This is where you list all the references, all your in-text citations to support your background and your fancy stats and any other interesting things that you included in the methods section. There's a couple different reference styles. APA, that's the American Psychological Association, they have their own style. There's the Vancouver approach as well, and that's typically used for medical research. In general, it doesn't really matter what approach you use or which style you use, but my advice would be just to pick a style and use it consistently. And that's all I have for you. So thank you all for your time. Sorry I couldn't be there in person or live, I would say, to be able to answer questions, but I hope you got something from this presentation. And also thank you very much to Dana for inviting me to get this presentation. Some contact information on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me if you need anything or have any burning questions that you would want to follow up on. All right. Thank you and have a lovely rest of the night.